Hello, I'm 𝗿𝗵𝗶. I'm a partner at 𝗿𝗲𝗴𝗶ci, an executive search and leadership advisory firm. I'm also the co-founder of The Council, a private network for senior executives. And this is Leaders in Motion. Today I'm joined by Jenny Lai. Jenny is President and CEO for Mainland China, Hong Kong and Macau at Bluebell Group, a platform that operates and scales luxury and lifestyle brands across Asia. Before Bluebell, Jenny was Senior Vice President and General Manager for Versace Asia Pacific. She has also held senior roles in China and the region at Louis Vuitton, MCM and Michael Kors. And earlier in her career, she worked at McKinsey. In this conversation, we'll talk about what it takes to lead and scale in luxury retail in China and APAC, how decision rights work or break between global headquarters and local teams, what has changed in the China luxury consumer, and what talent is hardest to hire for right now. Jenny, welcome to Leaders in Motion.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Thanks for having me.
Great. To start, I'd love a simple general introduction in your own word. What is your current role today at Bluebell? What's the scope? And what has been the journey that led you here?
Yes, absolutely. I'm very happy to share with you. My current role is as the president and CEO of Bluebell for Mainland China, Hong Kong, and Macau. And as part of this, I manage a portfolio of 15 brands in multiple industries, primarily in beauty, F&B, as well as fashion. And so our role is to help the brands enter the market, scale in the market, and perform well in the market. And really what we add is our local expertise, our quality of service, and also, of course, our local knowledge, relationships, and everything that we can bring to bear. Just a little bit about my background. I had, I would say, 3 phases in my career. The first phase, as you mentioned, is more on the strategy side. I first started as a McKinsey consultant in McKinsey, Germany. And then after that, I joined as head of strategy and business development at DFS Group in 𝗿𝗵𝗶𝗶 in San Francisco and then in Hong Kong. Then the second phase of my career, I would say, was quite operational in terms of the luxury and the fashion industry. I was the third employee for Michael Kors in Greater China. I joined this brand to build a new brand in the market from the ground up. So I went from being a very early employee and being involved, very detailed, from opening boxes to in the very first retail store to over the following 5 years, opening more than 120 stores in Greater China. After that, I joined Louis Vuitton as the vice president of merchandising. And then after that, in Versace as the general manager of Asia Pacific. So I've been extremely lucky because I think I've had a variety of diverse experiences across the different industries and as well as a very different business stages. So I've been in brands that were in a startup mode. I've been in brands that were successful and big and mature. And then now in a sort of more portfolio multi-brand stage at Bluebell, all of our brands are in fact quite diverse in different industries as well as different stages of growth in the market.
I wanted to have a quick comment on your journey, to which extent you already planned that you wanted to end up in retail and consumer and luxury when you joined McKinsey, and whether or not the journey ahead was already sort of planned, if you will.
It was absolutely not planned at all, Kevin. So for sure, the luxury industry is very beautiful and has an amazing history, but when I first joined McKinsey, in fact, I was a very, very academic person. I joined McKinsey instead of finishing my PhD in economics. And so when I joined McKinsey, it was really because of the caliber of people that I met through the interview process. And I was very interested, in everything that McKinsey had to offer. I was working in financial services and other industries. And so it was actually a chance meeting that led me eventually to be recruited as the head of strategy for DFS. But after joining, I realized how much I loved the industry, not just for its products and for the luxury industry, but also for the consumer dynamics and the brand building. And so it was an amazing opportunity that I just really fell in love with.
What do you think are the strength and quality that are sought after from consultants or people from the consulting background or within experience at McKinsey?
It's interesting because I think the reputation of McKinsey is, smart people doing strategic work, but on a more concrete level, how that applies to any business and situation. It means that you can work very well under pressure. People generally only hire consultants in moments when they need clarity or problem solved. The skill that I think is most important is how do you structure your thinking and how do you really get to the key things that matter and then be able to communicate and convince people of the way to go. And so that more than any, I would say, skills or, understanding more about the financial industry or a specific, I would say, content. Those are the qualities that I have found useful for my career in roles after McKinsey.
And in your case, what was the major skills or experience that was interesting for a DFS when you were hired, coming from McKinsey?
Yeah. When I was hired at a DFS, the context of the market was in a moment of flux where the Japanese traveling customer, luxury customer, was in a state of decline. And at the same time, there was a very, very new and exciting customer, which was the newly rich Chinese customer that, for the past 20 years has been a key driving force in the luxury market. And so at DFS, we were in a moment of adjusting our business model to meet this new customer, which was the traveling Chinese, which was the newly rich traveling Chinese, at a moment in which brands didn't really understand the market at all. And so my role, I had two roles there, but the first one I think is most relevant, was to, in fact, do what we called business development, both internally and externally. So I evaluated new brands that DFS might add to our portfolio. I evaluated new properties. At that point, we were entering Four Seasons and City of Dreams in Macau, and how much space each brand would get, as well as looking at our internal existing brands and making the recommendation and the actions on which brands we would further expand versus some brands that we felt perhaps were more relevant to be rationalized or reduced.
And moving forwards, what do you think were the achievements that enable you to get to the next step, to get to more senior roles? Do you feel that it was really the achievements that you demonstrated at DFS, or potentially more the relationship that you built, the trust, and the team you interacted with? What do you think were the success factors at the time?
For me, and probably for everybody, I think it was a mix. Even though I worked at 4 different brands, in fact, 2 of them were in the same group. 𝗿𝗵𝗶 was DFS and Vuitton, and Capri was Michael Kors and Versace. So I had mentors and guidance, common bosses in both of the separate brands, but within the same groups. So certainly relationships matter, but of course you must bring value. You must bring achievements. You must bring a track record. And so the ability to bring results, to show growth, to manage, initially my departments and then eventually in general management must be part of the equation. And so I was very lucky to both have, I would say, good mentorship and support in my organizations. But of course, I had to bring the results as well.
And it seems quite seamless looking back, but do you feel like at some points you might have some doubts in where the path you were taking would lead to?
Yeah, absolutely. I think for anybody who has had a diverse career like mine, you have to take a little bit of risk. And in hindsight, when I joined Michael Kors, now it's easy to look back and think, oh, it's a well-established brand. It's 120 stores. But when I joined, it was a startup. There was no office. There was I was like the 3rd employee. We had vendors and relationships that we were trying to establish where people didn't believe we were a real company. And so in those moments, when you come from an 𝗿𝗵𝗶, DFS, you feel you go with all the things that come with that. Definitely took a risk joining a new company. Also moving to Shanghai for the new company from Hong Kong, where DFS was based. So it was an absolutely new company, very startup environment. I was the third employee. We didn't have an office. We didn't have a permanent office. We were unknown as a brand. And so when we talked to landlords, when we talked to other potential partners, even settling logistics, there were many people that we spoke with that didn't even think we were a real company and worried we might flee in the middle of the night. So it was a big risk. It was definitely a big risk because, especially in fashion, you don't know what's going to succeed. You don't know if it's going to resonate. In hindsight, however, it was also one of the most fulfilling chapters of my career to help grow a brand from, it's very, very, very early stages to more than 120 stores. But of course, it takes a lot of hard work. It takes the right attitude. It takes a good market. It takes all sorts of things, resources. It takes all sorts of things to be successful the way that we were. But in hindsight, it was definitely a risky move.
How do you feel it is to build a team when you start from the beginning towards a team that is already a little bit more mature with 120 stores?
We definitely look for different types of competencies at the different business stages. So at some points, I would prioritize entrepreneurialism, agility, good attitude, really somebody who is a go-getter and super energetic. And at other points, we start looking for experts who are in their fields, industry. These things are not necessarily in conflict. It's just different balances in the growth journey. I think, at a beginning stage when you don't really have a lot of resources and you don't really have the brand, notoriety or positioning to speak of, what you have is the ability to share and communicate the future. And that's not something that you can do unless you have a clarity of vision. And so when I first started, this was something that was really important to me, is I had to be very clear. Okay. I had to tell people, these are the 3 or 5 things that we're developing, and we're going to work together to develop them. And these are our standards. I would say, secondly, as a principal, I always try to surround myself with people who were very smart and very curious and very willing to grow. And then we developed them. We were not hiring people with 20 years of experience. We were hiring for capabilities, not already necessarily developed skills. That's quite important in a startup, is when you can see the potential in your people. And then I think, thirdly, over time as we started growing, we could afford, more expertise, more seniority. But the real challenge is to make sure that everybody can work together. But I find that if, find people who are curious and empathetic and well-meaning and really focus on common goals, you can go a pretty long way.
Did you experience some transition or friction between the founding team and the new team? Usually, because of a difference of expectation in mindsets, it can sometimes clash.
We actually were lucky in that we did not in our particular situation. I can think of a few reasons why, and some of them have to do with us and some of them have to do with the market. The market at that point was super big and growing, and everybody was doing well in their careers, whether they continued at the company or were a new entrant. So I think the general hope and optimism and positivity of the luxury market at that point helped a lot. On my teams, I didn't see a lot of friction or difficulties between, I would say, sort of like the startup team as well as versus the people that we hired once we were already at scale.
How do you feel that this background helped you when it comes to building that team and also potentially even bridging with the headquarter or the regional headquarter and the leadership?
I think anybody with a diverse background, whether it's coming from overseas or other points of adjustment, I think has an advantage in any environment that they go to. I didn't feel that I had a particular advantage because it was from Hong Kong versus any other place, but I did find that I could work and was more comfortable in different situations. I guess I became comfortable being uncomfortable. And overall was really, I think it contributed to a lot of the qualities that I think are quite important in cross-cultural leadership. You can become more empathetic, you can become more calm, you can become more open. And all of these qualities, anybody can have. But there are definitely some experiences that I would say accelerated their development in me because I had to go through a lot of change and I had to go through these really great learning opportunities that would make me more resilient and more adaptable, whether it's working with my team here, whether it was, working with multiple teams as my scope expanded to cover Asia Pacific. And of course, continuously working with headquarters, working with the European and the American teams. It was incredibly valuable to have come from a background where there were changes.
And now looking back to build your background, like from strategy then to merchandising, any thoughts on how valuable an experience in merchandising could lead to a P&L or general management role? Or do you feel like any other functions or experience could have helped as well, as long as the achievements and also the results were there? Or do you feel like it had particularly helped you to get there?
At this point, when I look at leadership profiles, I see people coming from merchandising, marketing, CFO background. So I think there's amazing talent everywhere. For myself personally, coming from a heavy merchandising background, I was quite lucky because, one, I love product. So having merchandising always kept me really engaged and really excited about my work. And I think, you get much more out of your work and learning when you are so excited and happy to be doing your role. But as a pure function and competency, merchandising is also a quite good blend of financial analysis, trying to see into the future, really taking a lot of time to understand the customer and really trying to understand the end customer's needs. And so for me, I found merchandising, I would say, one, super interesting that kept me excited and engaged, and then two, helped me develop a breadth of skills from analysis to planning to customer insights that I still find very valuable in general management.
Interesting. I would like to understand your take, and I think this is also where when it comes to bridging, Western brands or international brands in China or Asia.
Yeah. I have a couple of perspectives on that. I don't think of it as tension, but as a matter of how do we get aligned on a brand, right? So there's a global brand direction, which has to be preserved. And then there's the local market realities on how do you execute it? How do you bring this vision to life? And, of course, you have to have the resources and the expertise and the autonomy to translate this vision into the local market. So everybody has to be aligned on what the brand stands for, what the brand's history is, what the brand's positioning is. And then over time, it's really, can you actually execute? Can you have the trust? Can you have the autonomy? Can you have the resources to do it? So in my experience, growing pains in a market entry is extremely common, both from the brands that I worked at initially, like bringing Michael Kors into the market, but also, with the variety of the portfolio of brands that I now manage at Bluebell. And so, it's quite an interesting thing. It's not easy. The market changes really, really fast. The biggest market that I manage is China. And China is a market that I think a lot of the rest of the world were more comfortable with before COVID because it had just been growing and growing for 10 and 15 years. And then this is not the case anymore. And then now everybody has to face the reality, and it's not easy to understand. And it's definitely not easy to act on from the headquarter level. And so there's kind of like two big shifts in the market. First of all, I think everybody recognizes how big the market is. What more and more people are understanding is how diverse it is. So we all know, okay, GDP is going to grow at 4.5% or 5% over the year. But if you look at channels, if you look at cities, if you look at sectors and subsectors, in fact, there's a great variety in terms of where the growth areas are and where there are challenges. I think a second point to really recognize is that China is very unique compared to other markets. Yes, you have brick and mortar, which is already very different. Then you have an online ecosystem that is completely different than the rest of the world. And so there are so many local and international players in China now that are very well resourced, that are very, very competitive, all going for the same market, and they are prepared to throw their resources and really invest in the market. So, coming back to where Bluebell is a bridge, right? Bluebell is a bridge from the brand's headquarters, and we are the regional office. We are very, very strong. We're established. We have local teams all across Asia. Just within my own territory, we have 3 offices in Shanghai, Hong Kong, and Hainan. We have dedicated teams. We have very, very high quality of service and excellence. And because we've been, and we're quite agile, we're very digital. We have a strong social team. We have a strong e-commerce team. And just from having been here for a long time, for being super reliable, for being, excellent quality of delivery, from working with our brands for a long time, we have really good relationships across all of the ecosystem. And so we're extremely connected to whether it's the ecosystem, whether it's the partners, our brands, but we're very connected to the customer. And I think this is one of the big values that we can bring to any brand, or any regional office can bring to their headquarters, is you have to really be the voice of the customer, know how things work here, and understand all the layers of performance, and not lump China into this sort of like big, massive market that's, very incomprehensible and so on. You have to understand it, and you have to spend the time and the energy and the resources to understand it. And that's something that I think very few brands can do directly from headquarters, or directly or remotely. It's very challenging, and that's something that we make sense of.
And what do you think is the most difficult thing for usually headquarter team to understand about China?
Yeah. I think the hardest thing about China that is, I would say, not necessarily difficult to understand, but a conception that is sometimes common overseas, is that China is China, one big country that is somehow very similar across the entire country. But from an operational standpoint, from a cultural standpoint, China, in fact, is something more like Europe. It's more like a continent in which there's sub-economies, there's different cultures, there's different languages, there's different physical builds where some people tend to be more tall, or some people tend to have different coloring. And there's even different sort of like little mini economies all over China. So that is something that I think is possible to understand from overseas, but in fact very difficult to actually operate on. Because from overseas, it's hard to understand that you cannot have one celebrity that everybody is going to like. You cannot have one format of an event that everybody is going to like. You cannot have one standard service model or one retail store build out that everybody will easily accept. And this is true even for Chinese brands, where, a restaurant chain in Beijing will not succeed if they go to another part of China. I think that's something that's really difficult. And that's why one of the big values that really having understanding of the market, and not understanding as in, you visit 2 or 3 times a year, really understanding the market, people who live here, people who speak the language, people who have to, use the payments and everything, people who live here and spend time to understand the rest of China. You have to have a local team. And I think that's why it's, in fact, many brands approach us, because this is something that has become even more obvious to brands now that the market is not as easy as it used to be. I think the speed of China is incredible, and it's very, very fast. And at this point, I've lived in the US, I've lived in Europe, I've lived in various cities in each of these continents, as well as throughout Asia. The speed of China is incredible, and it has to do with economic development. It has to do also with a culture where people are very curious and very open and so on. And this is something that I think is recognized. Again, it's recognized, and I think headquarter understands it, but it's difficult to actually act on it, right? Because if the last time that you've been here was 2 years ago or a year ago, and then, you come back to China after 1 year or 2 years, it's going to be totally different. You walk through the street, there'll be new buildings, new ways to order your food, new channels, new influencers. There's so much that changes very, very quickly in China. The customer's expectation for brands is very high, actually. So they expect, excellent service. They expect very, very good events. They expect beautiful store build-outs. They expect, responsiveness. They expect deliveries. They expect, and they see, this world changing and improving all the time. So the brand, to remain on top of mind and to remain attractive to a customer, also has to change because the market is changing and the market is moving and all the competitors are moving. So I don't think that it is that necessarily that customers are less loyal. It's that everybody else, your competitors, the market, everybody is moving very quickly. And so you as a brand or a brand operator must be extremely agile to keep your customer because everybody else is putting in the hard work to do so.
Luxury sector has been through different waves in China, and then lately it has a little bit more challenging. And how do you see overall the trends of the sector and what to pay attention for in 2026?
For luxury, as the customer has become much more sophisticated, has access to great things, very good eye, very high expectations, value and experiences will still continue to be an important part of 2026 because everybody knows more than they used to, and their values have changed over the past few years, partially accelerated by the pandemic. It's well documented that people had a little bit of luxury fatigue. And so now what people are emphasizing are health and wellness and quality of life and so on. So we still see, even though traditional luxury may be slowing or maybe having challenges, the very highest end of luxury is still relatively resilient because the perception of value is there. Then we also see other types of luxury gaining a lot of speed. So niche fragrances, which is very experiential, brands like 𝗵𝗵𝗶, whom we work with, is doing extraordinarily well. And we see daily luxuries like confectionery, chocolate, these things that bring a little bit of happiness and joy and feel-goodness into your life. That is the kind of luxury that is doing very well. Hotels, resorts, hospitality it depends on the brand, but is doing quite well. So I would say overall, also within the luxury industry, although a lot of the traditional luxury companies are not doing so well, there's many facets of what would be classified as luxury that are doing very well. And one day, of course, the big brands will also come back, but they will come back in a different way. It won't be only very much focused on products or on pricing increases and things like that. They will bring value and they will bring their story and they will bring, a different kind of value back to traditional luxury companies. But it won't be as easy as it was the first time around, which was when, 10, 15 years ago, when everybody was growing 8, 10, 20% every single year. The market is much smarter and much more sophisticated and much more discerning.
How do you think would be the perspective of Chinese local brands and relevance in the luxury sector in China, and whether or not they have the potential to also go global?
Yeah. It's interesting because there is definitely this trend towards luxury brands, Chinese homegrown luxury brands. And I think, everybody knows about 𝗿𝗵𝗶, everybody knows about 𝗿𝗲𝗴𝗶, consumer brands like Pop Mart or 𝗵𝗵𝗀 or, so these are all growing and they're all sort of like expanding overseas. And, there's a very lovely brand called 𝗿𝗲𝗴𝗶 for us. It's opened a store in Ginza. So I think their development in terms of going overseas is very different because, first of all, the domestic market is already huge. So a lot of the brands actually will take some time to really well develop the local domestic market because the market is enormous in China, just the domestic market. and they will know the credibility, they'll know the way to work, they'll have a story that is very resonant, naturally resonant with all of the consumers here, or more naturally with the consumers here. And then, as for going overseas, I do think that in certain sectors, it might be easier than others. And in certain overseas markets, it might be easier than others. As I mentioned, some beauty and cosmetics brands are already going overseas to Japan and to the rest of Asia. Bluebell has been approached by some Chinese brands to bring it to other countries in Asia. In ready-to-wear, it's becoming, higher and higher end. And in fact, a lot of, the best materials in the world, even from international brands, had originated in China. But there's, I think automobiles is probably next. Automobiles, I think everybody is knowing really about the EV development in China, the technology and investment that's being poured into that industry. So that's being, exported to some extent. So for sure, there will be a trend of Chinese brands going overseas. They're competitive. They're very well resourced. They're offering value for money. And then on top of all this, they're offering more and more in terms of story, in terms of resonance, and so on. But the path won't be the same for the different industries. It will be, and the path won't be the same into, whether it's into the US or Europe or the rest of Asia.
Do you feel that, as you know, China has a high adoption of digital? Do you feel that it could be an advantage for the Chinese brands?
To some extent, for sure. I think China is more digitally native than a lot of other countries. And so the innate understanding of behavior could be an advantage. But overseas, digital adoption is still not as comprehensive or as universal as it is here in China. You have digital competencies, but at the same time, you have to develop brick and mortar. You have to have the understanding of marketing and brand building and the customer. So there's a lot of aspects, but I can certainly see how some of the digital behavior competencies can be translated to overseas.
Back to China, to which extent do you feel that this omni-channel for brand is important? And also to which extent international brands understand this relevance when it comes to entering China? It's a whole different ecosystem. And the way the O2O strategies are quite different, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. From a just hard sales perspective, depending on the brand, their sales online can range from a low of 15-20% to the majority of the business. So just from a purely sales perspective, it's a significant chunk of the business, and the e-commerce ecosystem in China is completely different than the rest of the world. So on that sort of very, core way, for sure, it's very different than the rest of the world. But I think in addition to the pure sales aspect of it, online is where a lot of engagement and communication happens. And so whether I decide to purchase online or offline or somewhere else, I'm still getting all of my information and insights and engagement and selling techniques and so on. A lot of that is going to come from online, whether I buy. And so this part, I think, can be common across some countries, but can also be totally different depending on the country who's looking into China. But I would say the split between online and offline is not merely a split in terms of e-commerce versus brick and mortar sales. That would be a very simplistic way of looking at the market. I would look at, how do you build your brand? How do you engage with a customer? And that can happen at many, many different touch points, engagements, and events and activations. So it's quite different than the rest of the world, I believe.
Do you feel like there are some type of skill sets or talent that are still quite challenging to find in China, and potentially, especially in fields where you might be more innovative and more technology related? Do you feel like there are some gaps still that are harder to find than others?
Yeah, I think hard skills, I wouldn't say that's what's the difficult part in my experience. You have a very well-educated workforce, very curious, open to learn, excited. All of these things, somehow you can find a lot of the hard or technical skills, in the industry, or people who are super, going to learn. The most difficult hiring challenge I have is usually not for that part. And the hardest quality for me to find has more to do with a person's character. And I think this is an interesting aspect of hiring because, in China, the market was consistently growing until just 2 or 3 years ago. And so a lot of the candidates I used to meet have basically had a long history of sort of like growth, because the market has been growing and there's therefore a lot of opportunities, and sometimes any shortcomings are easily overlooked. But now the market is different. And, specifically when it comes to what I'm looking for, Bluebell is a very well-established company, but we are also almost always in a startup mode because our business is bringing new brands and new business models to the market. So we are, a well-established company, but also, having startups within our company, right? So in the best of times, it's not easy to do a startup. Okay. The market is difficult. And so I look for people who have a combination of, expertise and professionalism, but I'm also looking for people who are very entrepreneurial, very agile, very resilient. They have experience handling diverse and sometimes I would say difficult business situations or growing pains. I'm looking for people who are very curious, who are really open to learning, and who find the challenges of building a new brand and a new business not scary, but exciting. And that actually has been not so easy to find.
And do you feel that the experience of having talents who've been abroad, worked abroad potentially, or have like a multicultural background helps in working for international brands in China?
Yes, it can definitely help, particularly, for international brands, language, shared culture, understanding of the brand. These are all things that are very much easier with a profile that is international. However, also findable within fully locally educated profiles as well. But if somebody brings that kind of international background, generally they, as well as the company, may find it more easy to work together and have a shared understanding and have a good level of trust. In no way does that mean that a purely locally grown talent cannot do those things. I have had extremely talented and extremely effective purely local leaders on my teams. And so that is definitely present as well. But yes, having an international background can be quite helpful.
How would you say is the outlook or the trends of your sector, luxury, in Hong Kong? And how do you see the latest developments when it comes to brands, international brands in Hong Kong? And how do you see 2026 from your perspective?
It's quite interesting because Hong Kong was an artificially large market for many years because of basically travel retail. And then, as the market matured and there were more options for people, in a moment since Q3, Q4 last year, things are starting to look a little bit up. For sure, the new stadium helps. There's more performances coming to Hong Kong. There's a new group of visitors who are rediscovering Hong Kong, especially from Southeast Asia, Eastern Europe, Russia. And there's been great investment in the retail sector. For example, the development of the 𝗿𝗵𝗶 properties and so on. So Hong Kong will never be as enormous as it used to be. But Hong Kong is coming back to some extent, but it's coming back in a different way. It's coming back, I think, in a more healthy way. Where there is investment, there's more events, there's, more diverse tourists. And so, again, coming back to our favorite term, cautiously optimistic for Hong Kong.
Jenny, that was great to have you. It was very insightful and dense. Thank you again for joining the show.
Absolute pleasure, Kevin. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to Leaders in Motion. And if you want to go further, join the Leaders in Motion Academy, our executive program. The first step is simple. Subscribe to our newsletter in the show notes, and you'll get access to our exclusive insights and all the details about the Academy. This podcast is produced by Melanie Hong, who helps leaders and organizations create strategic podcasts. I'm Kevin Hong, and see you next time.